Guys, and thanks for joining me again. Well, on this video I thought I'd do a little follow-up video on my Fender Stratocaster 12 string here. And for those who haven't seen the previous video, I actually imported this in from Tokyo recently. And when it arrived, I was actually a bit disappointed with this because it had some pretty serious neck issues with it. And a good friend of mine who's very handy with guitars had a look at it, and he was under the impression that this neck was actually stuffed. It's got a pretty big bow here in the neck, and also what makes matters worse is the truss rod nut is actually buried quite deep up into the neck there. And I think that's a good point to actually say for anyone watching this video who might be buying a guitar in person or online, is to actually ask for a photo of how the truss rod nut is looking, actually, especially on a Fender neck, so you can tell a lot about that. So as I mentioned, this friend of mine was under the impression that this guitar neck was actually pretty stuffed and had nowhere left to go with it. So of course I've taken it into Brenden Mason at Real Guitars, and Brenden does a lot of work on my guitars for a second opinion. And Brenden was pretty sure that he could actually fix up this guitar, and I was actually incredibly pleased when I picked this up because he's actually got this guitar in a condition now that's actually playing well. So haven't had to buy a new neck. Now, a lot of people wrote in on the previous video and talked about this idea of actually clamping the neck and being able to kind of actually bend that bow back. And I did speak to Brenden about that, but he wasn't particularly keen on that idea. He was under the impression that probably about 2 or 3 months later, the actual neck would be back in the state where it was. So interesting. It was a good idea though. So, but anyway, I'm going to pass you over to Brenden now to actually have a talk about what he did to this guitar to get it back into the condition it's in now, which is actually playing really nicely.
The neck was the bigger part of the problem on this girl, and I had to do some severe manipulation of the fret surface. Luckily, the guitar hadn't been fretless, so it had an absolute pile of fret profiles, so I was able to manipulate the neck, and that was the bigger part of the problem, that the actual overall front shape was absolutely useless to try and set it up accurately with. The great thing about these, as opposed to some of the other 12 strings, is that you have individual intonation on each string. So all guitars, pretty well nearly 100% of guitars, the head nut is not cut properly, and if they cut it to the bone and you want to go either really light or really heavy strings, then you have to replace the head nut. So generally most guitar companies will leave the head nut slightly high, and this hadn't ever been cut correctly. Now straight away that's going to give you an open to scale error. The other thing that was a bit of a worry with this guitar is the fact that the actual truss rod in a perfect guitar, and I've got something over here at the moment, in a healthy Fender, you can see that the truss rod nut is virtually nearly flush with the end of the butt of the neck. Quite often people can misunderstand the use of a truss rod. The truss rod is not the answer to every neck problem, even though it can be an aid to problems in the neck. And quite often if a neck is twisted or let go a little bit in the halfway area, quite often it can be a fallacy to over-adjust the neck. Now the end result of that is exactly what's happened with the 12 string, whereby the truss rod nut has buried itself up into the neck and more than likely collapsed quite a lot of the actual support inside where the truss rod, where the actual retainer washer is. Now at worst what can happen there is if it keeps getting ground all the way through, then you run out of thread, and then the worst case scenario is you'll break the truss rod because you've run out of thread. I have a way of actually inserting a reinforcing plate, which is a relatively radical sort of operation, but I've been able to watch a lot of guitars over the years, and it is successful. When you're looking at what the truss rod's pushing against, it's nearly an exact same diameter washer in there. So Hence, it can actually start to collapse all the wood inside the neck, but there are ways to fix it. And now, Matt's got a fun 12-string to play with again. Ready for any bird song he wants to play. Let me think of who else. Oh, probably the Birds would be the best.
Tom Petty?
Tom Petty, absolutely.